Being a car manufacturer is no easy task, and occasionally a few cars slip through the net and become automotive flops. And in this video, I'm going to talk about 6 automotive flops, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were bad cars. It just means that they weren't selling in the sales numbers that they should have done. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Carson Ben. Sticking true to the thumbnail, I've gone for the Jaguar X Type as the first car. And I know what you're all thinking. The Jaguar X Type had 9 years of production runs. It was the best-selling Jaguar model for every one of those years. It couldn't have possibly been a misstep or issue in the brand. Well, unfortunately, there was quite a number of issues with the X Type. Now, I actually like the X Type. I mean, it's good. It's not as good as the old Jaguars, as you can see here. They just have a lot better in the 90s. But when it came to the early 2000s, now, Jaguar was struggling financially at the time, and then they had to put less resources into the new X Type. Now, they made a lot of sales, but not as many sales as they hoped, which was about 50,000, only half of the 100,000 units. The car was essentially a Ford Mondeo underneath, and that was the first issue. It was made very cheaply, even though it looked like it was made to be expensive. And because of this, it looked like a Jaguar. It had that cool little engine, and it mostly did well with that 2.5 litre V6. But people just didn't like it because it wasn't the car it should have lived up to be. And as a result, it was a flop in the sense that there's a lot of them now, and it's not rare at all. So you can actually buy one really cheaply, as I'll show you in a minute. They did a few facelifts over the years, and I think it looked a lot better. And honestly, I do like this car, as with a lot of flops, but it just was a bit of a design failure, and people did not rate this car. You can actually get one for less than £1,000. Not all car manufacturers created a car that was just a flop. Some became a flop and then became really good, much like the Avantime actually, and the Renault Avantime as well. Well, with the Avantime, the car was a bit of a flop initially in 2001, and that made it very rare. But it also became a bit of a popular car for a lot of fans. This is actually a really unique car, and I'll tell you why. The car, when it was first released, was just not needed. A lot of people had the Renault Espace, and there was a lot more you could get for less money. It was a very intriguing concept, but it had a lot of glorious fails to it, and a lot of people have always said this throughout its last 20-year history. Take the massive rear, huge doors. For a big family car, it only had 2 doors, which was crazy. It came in really unique colours, and it just looked very space age at the time, which I don't think a lot of people were ready for. Top Gear even took it racing, which was cool. A lot of the Renault that it was created from was just an old Espace made to look really funky, and it had a lot of swooping lines and really cool little indicators, lights, doors, and in that engine there wasn't much special really, but it was similar with the Velsatis. It just didn't sell very well at all and had an intriguing concept. For me, I love this car, and it's just so unique. And in with the Americans, as you were all expecting, there would be many flops from the Americans, and of course, this Ford Thunderbird was no excuse. After all of the amazing cars they made over the 50 years, which were very beautiful and alright in engineering for the most part, they did take a bit of a downturn. From the 1st to the 2nd to the 7th, well, the 10th wasn't as great, but the 11th generation was the final car, and it was made to evoke the design of the 1st gen from 55 to 57. Well, Ford did just that, and it didn't look very good. Now, there's a few fundamental reasons why it was a complete flop. Firstly, the ridiculous price tag of $50,000, which in today's money is even more, would be a hideous amount for just a small sports car with pretty much no good looks about it. It didn't work in other countries. It only worked in America because it was sort of a retro look back to the old days. But even the interior of what Ford and Chrysler were making back in the early 2000s was terrible. But wait, there's more. The V6 and V8 engines were absolutely abysmal as well, providing no power whatsoever, even though it did look good. You know, from parts, I can see where the modifications might look good for this car, but really, it didn't hit sales numbers. It sold around 60,000 units, which was a bit of a flop for Ford because they thought they were going to sell a lot more. The only redeeming feature was that it was in Die Another Day, driven by Halle Berry. I guess it looks like a Bond car. And surprisingly, if you want one in the UK, it's going to cost 20 grand. So it's not quite as good as the original. And on to the Americans. You guessed it, it's another one. And I actually really like this automotive flop. Sometimes there are good cars that come from it. Now, if you haven't already guessed, this is the Lincoln Navigator, but it's actually called the Lincoln Blackwood, which is formed into a pickup truck. Now, with the Lincoln Blackwood, it was a very unusual kind of car that came about because of the Navigator. Ford F-150 was doing very well, the best-selling car in America, and still is, and then they made the Expedition and so forth, so Lincoln thought they'd have a stab at it. Well, even though I like it, a lot of people really hated this thing, and it just did not sell in its numbers. Maybe people just thought it wasn't needed. It sold around 3,500 when it was expected to sell around 20. The 5.4 litre engine from the Navigator was still there, and that was pretty powerful, but really just lacked in kind of any performance, really. And you guessed it, it was only sold in black. They actually recreated a newer looking version, which looks a bit better, kind of, in today's modern world. Even though it was never as good as a Navigator, people claim this is rarer than a Ferrari, so I think that says quite a lot about the car in its own right. And you'd think it would sell well. It's a very rare pickup truck now. These actually still sell for around 10 to 15k, so still a rare car to find. Onto the Japanese, and as with all flops, some of these cars are super rare, so really actually cool to see in a way. Now, Jeremy Clarkson described the Suzuki X90 as one of the worst cars ever made, quite literally. And I can kind of see that. It just didn't look as good, or should have been as good, as what it could have been for the Americans. And the Americans were the main market here, as you can probably tell, based off like Jeeps and so forth. Well, the Suzuki X90 only sold 1,300 in Japan and barely touched 7,000 in the United States, not doing as well as the Jimny over Europe side of things. And they definitely did a lot better with the Samurai and Jimny. Well, the engine was pretty horrible, it just had no power whatsoever, and it was only really two-wheel drive, so it wasn't really a proper four-wheel drive car, and it was literally one of the smallest production runs of any car. It actually managed to be a Red Bull car for a bit, and you can pick up one of these for about £1,000 now if you wanted to, which is fairly cheap for. And finally, with many flops, it's hard to cover everything, but it is the Volkswagen Phaeton. A car, again, I actually really like. I really like flops. They're just cool cars that seem to just come off as a very rare car. Well, the Phaeton, as you might already expect, or might not expect, is on this list. And it's because it was a car that was built for the rich, but really wasn't sold for the rich and couldn't even be offered as a second-hand car for anyone who wanted it. Now, I should explain there are new Phaetons that have done a bit better now, but the Passat was already in place back in 2002, and the Phaeton just had no place for, at the time, most people buy Volkswagens. It was kind of sold as a limo that would be really, really fancy, and it was an amazing car in its own right, and obviously Volkswagen did a lot of work in it with the W12 that was put in it. But it just did not sell in the numbers, and Volkswagen, sadly, had to make a loss on this car, really. Even though it did look good, I remember playing it in Midnight Club, and it was a great car, and I loved driving it. It was just so unique and almost like a Bentley. But no one at the time wanted it, and you can get super cheap ones now for about £3,000. Hope you've enjoyed this Cars with Ben video. Don't forget to subscribe if you like car content.